evidence that a couple people are excited about the future, but I see the majority of them are actually anxious and also even fearful. And so this is something that is not surprising. It's normal considering what's happening in this world. And on this next slide, what you can see are several events in recent history that seemed to come out of the blue. Not all of these are negative things per se, but similar to the COVID-19 crisis, they all came to us unexpectedly and sometimes as a shock. So as a center, one of our roles is to help leaders like you develop the capability to deal with that uncertainty. So the question is, how do we help develop the mindset, the skill of finding and creating possibilities and opportunities despite the unknown that's in front of us? So one of these skills is futurist thinking. But how do we understand what it will happen in the future when things are changing all the time? With that, I want to ask the first question to Rahul, which is, decision makers right now are facing the stress of uncertainty. Help us understand the basics of futurist thinking, and how can it help inform what decision makers can do to confront this uncertainty? So Rahul, please take the floor.
Thanks, John. So you're absolutely right that there's a lot of shocks and discontinuities, and that's why futurist thinking is important. It's not just an expansion of what's happened in the past into the future, but really it's about thinking differently. And another reason, actually, if we go into besides shocks and discontinuities, look at the acceleration of what's really been going on, especially in the last 100 years. If you look at even consumption patterns, we've gone up 20 times over the last 100 years. Similarly, our world population has gone up 4x over the last 100 years. And the spread of industrialization and urbanization has significant impacts on the resources of our planet. So if you look at water consumption, fertilizer consumption, trends like the extinction of species, those have all gone up quite dramatically. And so it's not useful to take a linear frame forward to think about the future. And instead, we need to imagine what the future might look like with these shocks and discontinuities that you mentioned, and also considering the accelerating change. So with that, we'll go into what is really futurist thinking. And futurist thinking is not the crystal ball that you might see in the Harry Potter series, or it's not the Doctor Strange being able to look forward to 14 million futures, but really it's possible alternatives that might exist in the future, and to lay out some of the things that we might like to see, what we might not like to see, and so that it comes back to the present and we think about how we can act to get towards the things that we prefer and avoid the elements that we may not want to prefer. And so that's the futurist thinking. So as a consequence, futurist thinking is not really about prediction. It's not about getting it right, because if you were to get right, if you predicted or projected a future that was really disastrous, you'd want to hope that you influence it now. So the idea is not necessarily prediction, but presenting alternatives in a way that helps people take action now. Mm-hmm. And that's what futurist thinking is really about. And the last slide I'll do for this section is one on different types of possibilities to think about where to focus your time and energy when you're thinking as a futurist. So of course, you could be like Doctor Strange and talk about all the 14 million possibilities that exist. But frankly, because many of them won't come to pass, it's not worth spending a lot of time on them. Then where you really want to spend a lot of time is in this gray zone of plausible futures. And so that's where futures might actually happen. It's conceivable that it might happen, but people haven't spent a lot of time thinking about them. There's also another zone called the probable zone. And to be honest, those are already taken care of. They're already your business as usual plans. Take into account what the futures are, because these are just projections based on past data, past historical data, past patterns. And so you actually don't want to spend a lot of time in the probable zone here, but really what you want to do is spend time on the plausible zone, think about what you prefer, and then how do you get to those elements of the scenarios. So that's what what you want to do for futures thinking in a nutshell.
So thank you so much for that introduction to futures thinking, the basics of it. I know it's a very broad topic, but I know that you address like the most critical framework of it. What are some actual examples or interesting cases of business or government leaders using futures thinking? And how has this helped their group or their organization plan for their future?
Sure, thanks, John. So I'll start with talking about Shell actually, because they really were the pioneers of scenario planning, which is one of the staple tools of futures thinking. And Shell actually started this in the 1970s. So almost 50 years ago, they already started thinking about the future and they already started making scenarios. And where that helped them as a business is it really helped them to anticipate futures. Unlike a lot of other oil companies, they already built up credible scenarios about the future where oil prices was declining. This was unthinkable in the 70s and 80s, but they already thought ahead. You know, oil is a finite resources. It might decrease over time. The price might decrease over time. So how can we move our business to become more robust, more sustainable, and help our organization diversify? And so they already began thinking quite early on about renewable energy. And they use this to also help other countries think about this. So they help China think about natural gas. They help Germany think about renewable energy. And that's why they were able quite quickly to have a really resilient business. So even though there were shocks to the oil prices over the last few decades, Shell has been able to weather that quite well. So that's been really one of the ways in which you can use futures thinking really effectively to build a more resilient organization, both for yourself and for the larger ecosystems that you're a part of. I also talk about the Center for Strategic Futures. I mean, when I was there, just to give you a sense of the importance of futures thinking, we moved into an entirely new unit. So I was a founding member of this unit called the Strategy Group in the Prime Minister's office, so there could be more focus on futures thinking for the Singapore government. And really, one of the examples of one of the things the Center for Strategic Futures thought about several years ago is in fact this new way of living. So in the past, you could think of life being divided into four main stages, right? So you had your play stage when you were young, you went to school for a period of time, and then you went to work. And so these were distinct stages. And after you went to work, you finally retired. Very clear what your life is going to look like and what these four phases are like. We actually figured out that, hey, this doesn't make sense for the modern era. We're already seeing signs of moving into a phase where this is much more blended. So you already see this. Yes, when you're young, you play, but people already are kind of pushing their kids to learn earlier and earlier. Then in your learning phase in school, you see trend of longer and longer internships. People are taking 6 months, 1 year off school to start working. When you go to work, you already know that your skills now are not as long-term as they were in the 70s or the 80s. Actually, they become obsolete quite quickly. And so you have to think about learning while you're working. How do you do this? Constant upgrading, constant learning. And finally, when people retire, there's this concept of semi-retirement. Some people spend some time working. Some people want to spend some time learning. Either you learn a language to communicate with members of your family, you learn other skills to keep yourself active. So we have this whole blend, and what's a result of that is this organization called Skills Future in Singapore, and I joined in the very early days of Skills Future and spent some time there. And really the idea is how can we encourage people living in Singapore to really upgrade and upskill themselves before their skills become outdated or irrelevant, but really continue that process so that you're always relevant to tomorrow's economy. And so one of the initiatives is when we started this 5 years ago, we actually gave all Singaporeans above the age of 25 $500 worth of training credits so that they could use these towards upskilling themselves. And so the government will be supporting them in that measure. And we actually topped it up this year with another $500 for people to continue that learning going forward and to emphasize that this is something important. So these are just some examples of how futures thinking helps us in the now as well, make initiatives to prepare for a future that is going to be different than today. And then next, I'll share a little bit about the process, the scenario planning process, because this is really a staple of futures thinking. And I know this slide has a lot. And really what I'm going to do is just quickly walk you through from left to right what the process is, because this process, if you've done well and done robustly, actually takes 2 years to do properly. And that's how long it took us when I was there. And so you start off with a concept, a focal concern, something that you really want to address, and you get this through interviewing senior members of your organization, understand what frameworks are widespread. And so this could be something like what I described earlier, where the concept is the stages or the phases of life are integrating, and how do we address some of these. Then you move into the driving forces, and what are the drivers really that are going to affect what the futures look like. So this could be different learning patterns, blended learning, online learning, could be different ways of learning. That could be an example of a driving force. Then you move into scenario framework. So you want to describe different possible worlds, maybe a world where people learn a lot, but it may not have the outcome that's desired. Maybe a lot of people leave the country and go and find the best opportunity. So even though it's the steps that you wanted, it may not result in the outcome you wanted. On the other hand, maybe there are other ways besides learning that people are able to get up to speed, maybe a lot of self-learning. And so you end up with the outcome you want, but not maybe in the way that you wanted. And this is just to help people expand their range of possibilities and solutions that you could come up with. The big challenge with futures and scenarios is they set in the future, and people are really busy with what's urgent and what's pressing now. So you want to create stories. You want to engage people in emotions to help them get a sense of what is really going to be affecting them, so that they can launch into the future with more vigor and more energy. And then finally, you want to set out some strategies for the future. How do you connect the future into the present and bring that forward into your organization's work? So that's how you could use scenarios.
Okay, Rahul, thank you so much. So our last question is, what are some ways we can implement futures thinking today to prepare for the new normal? What are some kind of three strong takeaways that our viewers can actually practice themselves?
Yeah, sure, John. So I'll start off with the 3 broad ones and give you a really specific example of how you can make those happen. And so number 1, again, focus on the plausible zone. The probable zone is likely already covered by people who are doing more traditional strategy or strategic planning. The possible zone is just too wide. You might not be taken seriously or credibly if you present something that is too far out the imagination of other people in your organization. So you really want to focus on the plausible zone. That's where you can add the most value. Second, use creative ways to communicate futures emotionally. You want people to feel viscerally what it's like to be in one of those futures. And so reports are really not a good tool for this. Reports are good to create a base of options of what you might see, but you want to really use creative ways. And so that could be games, pictures, stories, just ways that people feel connected to the different possibilities out there. We used a game. I developed a game when I was at the Center for Strategic Futures, where people really felt what it was emotionally like to be present in one of those more challenging futures, with a description of what their archetype or what their character was. And so people could really feel the frustration when their character, which didn't have a lot of resources to start with, wasn't able to access the opportunities no matter how hard they tried. So that motivated people to then find new solutions, new policies. So how we help people and support people today. And finally, you want to make that link between the future scenarios into what this means now for us. What actions can we take in order to get the elements that we prefer and also avoid the parts where we don't want to prefer? So those are my 3 big tips for how to design future. And my specifics are really, I'll show you one from the Center for Strategic Futures, which is one of the driving forces that we came up with. And the template that we use to come up with the driving force is here. And really the idea you can break down from top to bottom. So you just define the concept quite clearly and simply. Then next you give some of the signs. How do you know this shift is already happening now? what might happen in the future possibly, and what are we not sure about that we should think about a bit further. And then finally, what are the questions for discussion? And this part should help you think about how you might think about this future item now, earlier in the present. So a really specific example, and this is something that we came up with in 2015 as part of our driving forces, is really this idea of human augmentation. And so with human augmentation, then you see that that's really the concise summary and concept of what's happening now. And then you have what's happening now in where we are. So where are we now? What's really going on currently? What do we know? So what do we know about this topic? If you look at the kind of research that's happening in human augmentation, you can see that the investment in human augmentation is quite high, and the cost for some of these measures to go to are low. And then finally, if you go to the final section, which is what are we going to do next? What are some things that we don't know? Then that helps us think about, are there ethical considerations? Are there political considerations that we might want to consider? What does that mean for us now? You know, the example of the Chinese scientist who experimented on CRISPR, this gene editing technology. What are the implications of something like that happening? So those are some concrete ideas in a concrete way. Actually, a lot of the driving forces that we came up with are in fact on the Center for Strategic Futures website. So you can actually download the copy and see what we came up with and use that if you want as a template for generating your own emerging strategic issues or driving forces if you'd like.
So Rahul, it seems that we already have a lot of questions. So with that being said, why don't we just go into it? Right now we have about 20 minutes, which are about 18 minutes, which is a fair amount of time. And I want to ask this first question from Terrence Leong. So scenario plannings can be quite manipulative based on how the person thinks. If it's an optimistic person, be more positive, and vice versa. So what are your views on this, and how can we not be biased while looking at possible scenarios?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I think, so there are two perspectives here, right? So there's one of the scenario generator. And so if you're thinking like a futurist, you're going to be generating the scenarios. And then there's another one about somebody who's receiving the scenarios and how you're best placed to receive the scenarios, right? And so I can talk about both of these. So if you're generating the scenario, you want to do it in a way, you're right, that minimizes the amount of biases. And so one of the ways to do that is to create data or to be clear about what the outcome is in terms of providing quantitative numbers. So for example, you could say in a future scenario, the economy of your country has slowed to a 1% GDP growth, or even is at a negative 1% growth. You could use words like the economy has been in a recession for the last 3 years. So that in a way removes the biases, because these words have a very specific meaning and you can't really move away from that. You also want to make sure that there is, of course, some room for interpretation, because the idea is for different people to think about the scenarios differently. So to give you a tangible example, and this will start addressing the second question about how you receive scenarios. If I painted a scenario where, hey, the economy was really doing really well, and you used growth numbers to indicate that, but you also said that, hey, the growth really goes to a very small group of people, really wealthy individuals, a few big corporations. You want to leave the space for somebody to interpret that as, is that something I want or something I don't want? So it's an art, really, when you're designing a scenario, to be able to provide some of those base level statistics, but also have the people who are receiving it be able to imagine, hey, do I really want to live in this scenario or not? And conversely, just to complete the example, if I had a scenario where the economic growth is slow, but there was a lot of interaction between people, you really felt this spirit of connection with people from your community. There was a lot of activity going on in the shared economy, so a lot of sharing, exchanging that doesn't contribute to GDP, but really contributes to people's happiness and well-being. You leave the space for somebody to decide, do I want to be in that scenario or not? Is that something that's appealing to me or not? And so as somebody who's receiving a scenario, you want to really be able to put yourself, imagine that really well, and imagine if that's something that, what are the elements that appeals to you and what elements don't.
Mm-hmm. Rahul, so just to all our viewers, just make sure to put your questions in the Q&A, and then you guys can have the chance to upvote them. Okay, and then we actually have one question from Peter Law. He is from Malaysia. There's actually he has about 40 upvotes on his question. If there is one thing, so taking a look at the leaders in Asia, in North America, around the world, if there's one thing leaders need to do things differently after the COVID-19 crisis, what would that be?
It's hard to narrow down to one, certainly. I think I'll try two if you don't mind. So one of the things I think, and it is difficult for anyone to do this, and certainly including leaders, what I would love to see is communication balanced between transparent, so being quite clear about what's happening, what we can expect to see in the future, despite the uncertainty, right? So to the best of our knowledge, what is really going to happen. But you also want to do this in a way that is not alarmist. So you want to do this in a way that is hopeful and optimistic. So you present a realistic picture of what's going to happen, what the measures that are going to be taken, how the pandemic might unfold, or not just a pandemic for that matter, but really any difficult situation might unfold, but also present the steps that the government might take, or the leader of the organization might take to ameliorate this. What might you do, and what can citizens or employees expect in the future? So if you can find that balance, I think that's really helpful, because people know you're being honest, and people feel reassured that there are measures that are going to be taken to support them or collaborate with them in a way that's helpful. So that's one thing. And I think the second, what we're seeing, at least a response from the ground, is people say right now what they really want is to change the dynamic in terms of resourcing. We've really focused a lot on efficiency. What's the most efficient way? And of course, the most efficient way is just-in-time supply chain. It's just having the right amount of resources to fulfill demand, just the right amount of supply. But what you're seeing with a crisis like this is actually what you want is a lot of resilience. And part of resilience includes redundancy, which means you're going to have a lot of extra supply. So in this pandemic, the example of the amount of hospital beds, amount of ventilators, amount of capacity in hospital or medical capacity at large, people seem to be saying actually it's okay not to be super efficient, because that means we can be more resilient if we have more rather than less. And so that's something leaders need to think about, is rejigging that balance between efficiency and resilience. How is that going to change?
Mm-hmm. Very good insights, Rahul. We have another question, and I think this has to do with your background in starting Skills Future. This is from Great Bayani Mabuti from the Philippines. What would be the critical necessary skills of leaders to prepare for the future?
You know, I'm going to go and share something that's really important. And actually, I found in my work now, working in technology, I found this relevant both for leaders thinking about the future, but also in really anybody. And I think the biggest skill that you really need to prepare for the future is empathy. And the reason I say that, both, and I'll talk about it from a futures perspective and a tech, which is of course the industry of the future perspective as well. And the idea is you really want to be able to build something, build a future to connect with people. So if you really understand what are people's hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, their fears, that then allows you to build scenarios that help them tap into those emotions, right? If you build a scenario and people, yes, I connect with that, that's my dream, that's the world that I want to live in, they'll be more motivated to contribute towards achieving that world. If you're able to build a world that is really scary for people, they're going to do whatever it takes to avoid getting to that world. And so for you to build those worlds effectively, you need to be able to understand or feel what these people are feeling, and be able to create scenarios in that way similarly, that it engages people emotionally. So that's what it means for leaders of the future from that side. And even from the technology community, in fact, I've spoken to a lot of people from Silicon Valley just because of the work that I'm doing in building an experimental technology department in government. And what they've consistently said is really the most important skill is for people to understand your user, really understand your user, because that helps you shape what product you're going to build. It helps you shape the direction of the product, what is the problem you're solving, but also what experience your user is having in dealing with that product. So really it's a consistent theme. Anybody who wants to be a leader in the future, you really need to understand what drives the people that you're going to be working with, that you're going to be working for, and that you're going to be building products for. Whether your product is technology or otherwise, you really need to understand what is behind the user and the experience.
Thank you, Rahul. So we're being overwhelmed with several questions. I'm so sorry that we're not going to be able to answer all of them, but if you do have questions, or if you see a question in the Q&A box, please don't put it in the chat box, put it in the Q&A box. And you're also able to upvote questions that you want to hear responses to. So our next, so by democracy, our next question is, how does a futurist imagine the post-coronavirus pandemic world? So kind of using your own framework, Rahul, how do we look at our current reality right now?
So I mean, the idea is how is the future going to change, right? And I think one of the key questions I think we all need to ask ourselves is, when we go back, what do we want the new normal to look like? And so what I mean by that is, what are the things that we really want to keep that we had in the old world? And those could be ideas of how we work, and what are the things that we want to change, right? So we might want to keep, for example, at least for me, I really like the field of people development. I really enjoy teaching, and those are the things, some of the things I definitely want to keep about the future. And one of the things that we've discovered about the current pandemic that makes us want to change some aspects of our lives. So that's really the fundamental question. So to give you some examples, a lot of people are saying, hey, do I really need all the things that I used to do in the past or not? Because I can manage without a lot of these extraneous things. Do I need a lot of the consumerism that I had? A lot of other people are also seeing an increased connection with their families, with their friends online. For me, I got in touch with some of my college friends who I hadn't seen in years online on a call, and it took a pandemic for us to do this. And what we asked ourselves is, why did it take us a pandemic for us to get on a call and have time together? It's the same with my extended family. We're now more in touch because a lot of people are spending a lot of time at home, and so there's actually more time that's created. And so can we bring some of these changes, right, that we really like into the future, and how can we do this? And that's really the core of the question that we need to ask ourselves. Like, what do we want to keep that we've discovered about ourselves, about our organizations? And this can be also things like telecommuting. Telecommuting seems to work really well for technology-focused organizations, or organizations that are prepared or have now made preparations for it. Because if you do that, that can lead to a much more inclusive workforce. You can now include, say, for example, parents who need to care for children at home. They can be more involved. People who have some form of disability or impairment, they might be able to be more involved. So if you think about what can you keep from this pandemic actually, and use it to change your previous normal into a new normal, that can be really powerful in thinking about how to prepare for the future.
Thank you, Rahul. So this is our next question. If future possibilities influence our present actions, what is the interval time we should have before changing our actions, before considering another future possibility after every reality check? So I think, just maybe to simplify this question, how often do we iterate, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, so if you're thinking about a major exercise, just to give you some ballpark figures, right? Companies like Shell, organizations like the Center for Strategic Futures, we do stuff roughly once every 5 years. And that's because it's a major exercise and it takes 2 years to construct really, really detailed scenarios. Now, does it mean you only look at things every 5 years? No. I mean, the answer is as soon as possible. So if you build like the human augmentation example I showed earlier, if you can build something quickly or you observe a trend, honestly, the answer is if you see something that should be changed, you should change it as soon as possible, as soon as immediately feasible. Because if you want to prepare and you think something is going to help you prepare, you should do it as soon as possible. That's really how you should prepare for the future, and you shouldn't be afraid to adapt. Of course, there are some things that are going to require long-term investments, and so you should think about how you invest in those, and with those, you want to spend a bit more time thinking about the implications for the futures and what might happen as a result of long-term investments, and especially large-scale capital investments. But for things that require simple behavior changes, actually you can implement some things really, really quickly. And so don't necessarily rely on the weight of that. If you see some trends be happening through scans that you might have done, you might have a tool that allows you to scan all the news story, say in your country, and take out of the news stories what are the key words, what are the key sentiments, and you observe a trend quite quickly using tools like that. Then you can quite quickly generate an action option and try it. Especially if you have quick feedback and something that's low cost, then you can consider trying something for a small organization. And that's what we do in my organization currently at Open Government Products. We try things out, we get feedback quite quickly. With remote working, we haven't worked remotely this much. So we're trying different things out. We're trying different tools out. We're trying a tool called Remotion, which is put in your presence online, see if you're online, and people can just, if you put yourself available, people can just video call you straight away. And so we're trying this out. We try different versions of this, different companies, to see what interface people like, what products people like, and then we quite quickly move towards one because it's a low cost. There's a lot of free trials out. It's just like how you try Zoom, you try Google Hangouts, you see what works, and then you go with that solution. It doesn't mean you can't change it in the future, but you try stuff and you work it out. So I would encourage you to actually do stuff sooner rather than later. Try it out, and if it doesn't work, then you can pivot quite quickly.
Mm-hmm. Rahul, we just have about 4 minutes left, so let's try to tackle maybe 2 more questions. So this one it's not an easy question. A lot of people are facing the specter of unemployment. What is your take in applying futurist thinking in facing unemployment, especially since it's very difficult to give ourselves a timeline on when we'll be hired?
Yeah, you're right, John. This is probably the most difficult question. I think, with unemployment, it's a very personal thing in that everybody has their own particular context that you're dealing with. So for example, some people have built up reserves over a period of time, and for them, how many months you could draw on your reserves to be able to sustain your life. You might want to cut down on your expenses, but you have a certain runway that you can afford, and so you can use that time to build up your own capabilities to make yourself more attractive to employers, right? You could build projects on your own or collaborate with people to be able to build something that might make you better positioned towards getting employed, right? So some people might be in that situation. And so for that, you want to think about, if you're in that category, you want to think about what are organizations going to need in the future and what are they going to need now? What spaces are expanding? Because it's not that the whole economy, the whole world is collapsing. Really, you're also seeing a lot of growth in the medical space, in the space, the mental health and wellness space. You're seeing a lot of actual growth that's happening because people's needs are changing. It's not that they're reducing, they're just changing over time. And so if you can identify what are some of these areas that are growing, and especially the ones that are going to grow in a sustained way for a prolonged period of time, in that move from efficiency to resilience, then that can really help you position yourself much better for that kind of world. Now, that's a subset of people who are a bit more fortunate, right? Then, of course, there are these people. There are another subset of people who are going to be less well-positioned. You don't have reserve. Think about students who are just graduating this year from university or from a polytechnic or for any institute for that matter, and trying to enter the workforce. It's tough because you're competing with people who are have much higher credentials, a lot of people who have been laid off. So how do you compete with them? And so then you want to think about how can you design something differently, right, for yourself, because maybe some of the people who are more senior are used to a certain salary, a certain lifestyle that they need to provide. They might be more later on in their family journey. They might have more needs to take care of. If you're just graduating or just starting out, how can you minimize the needs that you have, so that, and what it means then is you can be more creative about the types of opportunities. For example, you can propose traineeships. You can propose working on something that is semi-paid, that is part paid. You can do a part-time role because you may not need as much income as somebody further along in their life journey. So you can be creative in the types of opportunities that may not require as much investments by companies to invest in you as an individual, and yet you can position yourself better for the future. So that's a way to think about it. Are there other creative ways? What are the other creative ways you can position yourself and where you are to be appealing to employers?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I appreciate how you were able to address it to both sets of our audience members. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Just to let you know, we are actually, in our follow-up emails, we're going to be sending resources. Rahul has informed me that he will also send the resource page for the Center for Strategic Futures. We're also going to send some links of articles, Harvard Business Review articles that kind of help, that talk about some of the frameworks that Rahul discussed today. But thank you, Rahul, for being so generous, not only with your time, but with your knowledge and insights as well.
Thanks, John.
So unfortunately, our time is over, but I'd like to make some important announcements before you go. So in our next, so we will continue the Future of Leadership Live online seminar series presented by the Star with Leading with Influence 2 weeks from now, as well as Adaptive Leadership 4 weeks from now with my colleague and president of the Center for Asia Leadership, Samuel Kim. But next week, we will also be running a webinar entitled How to Build Your Team's Learning Mindset Amid Uncertainty. Now, we have some other announcements as well. I'm very, very pleased to inform you that if you have registered, so I'm talking to everyone that can hear this right now, but if you have registered for this live online seminar, you are entitled to a discount of 400 ringgits if you decide to enroll in any of the physical workshops that will be run in Malaysia. For 2 or more workshops, there's a discount of 600 ringgits. And you will receive an email from our partner, The Star, with full details tomorrow. For the How to Think Like a Futurist, that is going to be taught by Rahul Daswani as well as Samuel Kim. And next thing I want to share is about the programs that we're doing right now. So if you're interested in bringing this to your organization, for example, if you're interested in having Rahul speak directly to a group within your organization through a webinar or virtual live lecture, we also have another network of speakers as well. Please do reach out to us. We are also currently designing, running, and delivering blended online learning programs from 4 weeks to 12 weeks. And so we are working with our clients to do this as well. And lastly, please do connect with us. Connect with Rahul. He's been generous to share his contact information here. You can also, I really encourage you to follow him on LinkedIn. He is always posting very interesting articles and insights, and so it's an education in and of itself. Please do visit our center's website for more information as well about what we do. If you're curious about what we do and about any of our programs, do follow us on our social media platforms for leadership insights, articles, and announcements. My contact information is also there on Instagram and also on email. And of course, I want to thank our media partner, the Star Media Group, for their support. Please do follow them on their website as well as their social media platforms. They do have a lot of interesting programs that are happening all the time, and I encourage you to follow them. And next, so once we close, if you could fill out the exit survey that will pop up when you leave, that will provide us with very valuable feedback to continue to improve our programs moving forward. And lastly, thank you for your time today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And if you are on the other side of the world, we hope that you have a good evening and a good night's rest. We do hope that you and your loved ones stay safe during this time. With that, thank you so much, and we hope to see you again next time.
Thank you.